Hey, I'm Brian Russell. I want to talk about the book of Numbers. Again, Numbers is one of those neglected books. It's repetitive. It doesn't always seem to go anywhere. It kind of meanders. Israel's trapped in the desert. But again, what we want to do is we want to remember the framing here. It's part of the Pentateuch, and it's the connection between Leviticus and essentially the book of Deuteronomy and really the entrance into the land. Now, Numbers follows Leviticus, and what's important is to see that, in a sense, the first 10 chapters of Numbers is a continuation of what we saw in Leviticus and even in parts of Exodus. From Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10:10, this first unit, Israel is at Sinai. Now, what happens in this section of Numbers is that Israel has a census that's recorded. Now, that's important because we're going to have another census in chapter 26, but what we're going to see, this is going to be 2 generations. So Numbers is about the passing of generations, and really it records one of the tragedies that takes place in the book. And so again, this is a continuation of the Sinai material. Now, if we think about Israel being in the wilderness, which is where they are here, especially in this middle section, Israel is also in the wilderness from Exodus 15:22 through Exodus 18. So they leave Egypt, they're in the wilderness, they're at Sinai, they're in the wilderness, and then they're eventually in the promised land. So let's just observe that phenomenon. So we get Egypt, wilderness, Sinai, wilderness, promised land. So notice the framing that around Sinai is you have the 2 period experiences of wilderness wandering by the Israelites. So there's a lot of things going on here. And again, we have 2 generations. Like I call this the disinheritance of Generation X or Generation Exodus. And then we have the inheritance of Generation Next, the generation that comes after all the events that happened at Mount Sinai. Now, what are some structures that take place? Well, the obvious ones are we have a contrast between these generations. The generation who experienced the Exodus fails, right? They grumble. And what we see here is a sort of a pivot. Essentially, what takes place here is we have expectations, and then at a key moment in chapters 13 and 14, God's people hesitate and they are afraid to go into the promised land, so God disinherits them except for Joshua and Caleb, who are faithful in their work, and all the Israelites die in the desert. This kind of reaches its bottom with the Baal or the Balaam stories, and then the Baal of Peor when God's people are involved in apostasy. So this whole generation dies out. So there's a contrast between generations. Now, another major contrast is the reboot. This is a contrast of expectations, because you might expect, because of this massive failure of the generation of the Exodus, that it would be the end of Israel. But instead, there's another census, and lo and behold, we find out there's still a huge amount of Israelites, and that this generation then begins to inherit the land. They take the Transjordan regions. Those are the area that would be east of the Jordan River. And they begin to inherit the land. So they begin to experience the fulfillment of God's promises. And that gets epitomized in the framing device that's used in the last section. In chapter 27, we learned about a family, Zelophehad, who has daughters and not sons. And Zelophehad dies, and we find out at the end of the book that his daughters, not the sons, because there's no sons, but the daughters get to inherit they get the inheritance of their father. So we have this positive message that takes place here at the end of the book in this climactic sections. We get a contrast of expectations that despite the sins of the previous generation, God still leads them into the promised land. Now, there's a whole bunch of recurrences that go through here. And again, Numbers is kind of an anthology. You read about, there's lots of little snippets of poems. So like you can look at chapter 6, 24 to 26, chapter 10, 35 to 36, chapter 12, 12 to 6 to 8. There's just all kinds of little poetic phrases that sit within the book of Numbers as though the author has compiled from other sources. It also mentions things like the books of the wars of Yahweh, for example, that show up in the book of Numbers. So you have references to other books. Now, what else is here? We also have a recurrence of grumbling. That's especially in this section. We have grumbling about Moses' leadership or challenges to Moses' leadership or grumbling about their circumstances. That's a recurrence, and that's a marker of this generation. There's also geographical markers. So this book, the rest of the book is marked by geography that takes place. There's some legal materials scattered through the book of Leviticus. And then we have lots of language about inheritance and taking possession of the land. And then in chapter 33, we get a summary of the events that take place with Israel and how God has been faithful essentially to his promises for them. So that's a little bit about Numbers. I don't want to say a whole lot more other than we see this whole contrast of generations. Now, let me say one other thing about as we look forward. So notice we have two generations in the Pentateuch here at Sinai. We have this generation that comes out of Egypt, and then we have the generation that's going to go into the promised land, and that's going to be the generation that Moses addresses in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's going to be the generation that Joshua leads into the land in the book of Joshua. And this is the most successful generation in the Old Testament. Everything goes well for them, but what's interesting, their parents failed, and what's going to happen to the generation after Joshua's generation is we're going to see failure again. You can go to the book of Judges and see what happens as soon as this initial generation passes. Look at Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through about 10 or 11, and it talks about a generation that didn't know the Lord raises up. And so what this teaches us is that you can have a disobedient generation, and that doesn't mean that you won't get a faithful generation after it. But we also learn from going into Judges that just because you have a faithful generation doesn't guarantee the future. So obedience is always a necessity in the present, right? Regardless of whether you had good examples or bad examples before you. You always have the opportunity to live out the life that God calls us to live. And here again in the book of Numbers, we see that the Sinai generation passes, Joshua and Caleb's generation rises up, succeeds. Again, I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.